Music would be good at this part of the program. It'd be very good. As the book is being introduced, it has nothing to do with age. And today's guest is in this book. It has nothing to do with age. In fact, he's in a couple places, one of which, of course, is chapter 13, 12 and 13. But in any event, I'd like to, first of all, acknowledge on my left, my far left,
Tony, yes.
Oh, that's
still Tony.
And actually, the three of us were running this morning, and what came up was called the 3 S's, or S cubed. S cubed. There's an S for Tony. There's an S for our guest, Jonathan, and friend Jonathan Jordan, and an S for me. However, I'm not allowed to convey in public what that represents. It's an acronym, and I'll just leave it because you may have heard what you hear on the trail stays on the trail, and it's important, believe me, as they will acknowledge, it's important to leave it on the trail. And I may share it with Linda afterwards, but at this particular point, it's just between the three of us. Jonathan is a man of many talents, and so we're going to find out a little bit about Jonathan and some of his exploits, both as far as his mental toughness goes, and also he's also a defense attorney in California with an office in San Diego. But in any event, Jonathan, we're going to start with a quote by Robin Williams, and I'd like you to relate this quote to you. It's per Robin. You're only given a little spark of madness. You mustn't lose it.
Okay. Well, you mean relate it to myself?
Well, who else?
Okay.
Sounds like our run
Well,
today.
I want to know who gave me the spark. I'm not so sure it was just a spark. Nevertheless, I think that probably what it means to me is that you develop your own personality in such a way that differentiates you from the people around you and the community you're in, and makes you an individual. Now, as you live your life and as you choose to exhibit what your characteristics are, the length to which you go to differentiate yourself from the public, from the masses, from the other people, is how big the spark is.
I think that spark is huge. It's huge. And in fact,
well,
the spark, this forest fire.
Yeah, the spark could become fire size at some point. And where it goes from there, nobody knows. But I think for me, that's pretty much the way I would relate it.
So you're marching to your own drummer.
I think we all do. It's just how each of us, you know, what the dance looks like.
Okay. Well, I know part of that dance is mental toughness. And I'd like you to relate and tell us about your mental toughness, where you think it got developed. But we've had conversations about mental toughness, and I'd like you to elaborate on the idea.
Mental toughness, referring back to the conversations we've had, and with Tony, initially, my first feelings about that are, I think mental toughness is initially in the eye of the beholder. I think that it's very similar to people that refer to other people as heroes, and then when those people are spoken to, they don't really see themselves as heroes. But if you have to put the term mental toughness and apply it to someone, I think for myself, it has to do with first establishing parameters on how you're going to define it. And secondly,
Will you define it?
mental toughness to me is essentially an individual that has the mental toughness, basically sees a goal and doesn't really see obstacles that people normally would in the achievement of that goal. Now, whether you want to call that the person is committed to that wholly, whether the person, regardless of what any type of outside information or other distractions may occur, he's not going to be deterred from his goal. You know, it has different feelings and definitions, but generally, the definition I would apply to it is an individual that puts a goal in front of him and really doesn't see a distraction or an obstacle to the goal.
So when we did the 100-mile ride and tie, how clear were you of the obstacles?
I really didn't see an obstacle that, you know, you and I couldn't overcome. I had never, you know, clearly I had never gone that far with you and Gypsy, the horse. Mm-hmm. We'd done a lot of races, but it became more of the pursuit of an adventure rather than something that, if you sat down and thought about it, would be so grueling and would be so never-ending that you would get turned off by it.
It didn't take you long to agree to do it.
Exactly, because I was doing it with you. But
it's always easy to start.
That's right. And so you just have to keep the easy to start idea, you know. But I really didn't view it as something that there was anything that could happen short of breaking a leg or something that was not something we could overcome. Blisters, fatigue, whatever, were all things that we knew we were going to have to deal with, but there was nothing that was, you know, preventative that was going to stop us from getting through it.
But something did happen.
Well,
towards the end of the...
Yes, it did, and it was something that nobody ever could have thought about. It almost stopped it, but not because we gave up, just because we would have been disqualified. But
because?
We were running out of time.
Well, we're going to go back to the definition, but before we
right.
do, Tony raised a good question.
Well, how did mental toughness, you know, come into play during that time?
Well, what... For everybody,
the last 10 miles, right?
Well, what everybody doesn't know that's going to watch this is that about midnight, I got lost in the dark and had never been on that trail before. And at certain aid stations, you have cutoff. You have to be there at certain times. And Frank had taken the horse and gone way ahead of me. And there were no markings.
I wasn't lost.
Frank wasn't lost because Frank, you know, the horse knew where it was going. Frank didn't. And there were no markings. And I have to say, I went on one trail and it ended up in somebody's front yard. Well, the dog started barking, so that was the time to leave that area.
So you knew then.
Yeah. Got back and said, well, and I still don't know how this occurred, how this unfolded the way it did, because I ended up at the proper place, or at least I ended up on the road that took me to the proper place. But you're right. I got very discouraged and at times thought, what's the point, you know? But then if you've done this and you've done other things before that required a certain mental toughness, you go and have that conversation and you know what you're doing to yourself. And so you just kind of laugh at yourself and say, yeah, okay, next.
You know what some of the thoughts that I had during that, because I was worried. Tony, I hadn't seen Jonathan. It's been a long time. People are on their horses, because there was an endurance ride going on at the same time. And they're passing me, and I said, have you seen my partner, Jonathan?
No.
And everybody said no. So I'm thinking, what am I going to tell Tara? What if I never see Jonathan again?
He fell in a sinkhole.
It just disappeared.
Jonathan disappeared. Tara, I just don't know. That was
Right.
some of the thoughts that I had.
Well, I don't know how many extra miles I ran off trail, but I was out there a long time, and the idea of, well, if I could just get to the place, I don't care if we finish, occurred to me a couple of times.
Okay.
But you recognize when you've, depending on how you've lived your life and done certain things that most people think that spark of madness have grown into a lot bigger thing. You know what you're doing to yourself. And so it's almost a mirror that you're talking to, and the mirror finally says, come on.
Get going.
You know what's up. You know you're not quitting. So keep moving. Don't have to slow down now. And so that, I think, is an example. Now, other people may have different ways of doing it, but I think that's an example of mental toughness. It's when you know what your mind is doing to convince you that this particular feat or this particular action is a little more than you thought, and you start creating the rationalization for not completing or not finishing or not pursuing the goal anymore. The mental toughness comes in when you then take that to the next level and you say, okay, we know where this conversation's going. Just shut it down and let's go.
Would you say that then by running every day or 5 to 6 days a week then takes mental toughness to go out in the morning or evening?
Well, I think initially it takes a lot of mental toughness because it's not enjoyable at the level that it is at other times each and every day. And so you develop this routine that at times can be boring too. But once it becomes part of your life, and once you recognize that a lot of the reasons you feel good, not only about yourself but physically, is due to that, then again your mind takes another look at this and it says, well, if I don't do it, will I feel bad? And sure enough, you do.
Yeah.
And so, I think mental toughness has to be viewed in much of a literal way because of the word mental. Mm-hmm. 90% of this is mental.
Between our ears.
Between our ears, because it is so easy in every walk of life to rationalize away, to discuss away, to ignore away certain things that are in your life that will certainly turn you away from what you're trying to do or want to do. Mm-hmm. And so you just have to turn that conversation that's slowing it down into the other conversation, which is, I know what you're doing.
See, that happened in 2008. In 2009, I think, is another example of your mental toughness.
Oh.
Would you care to tell us about, and you know what I'm referring to?
Sure. Well, I was diagnosed with head and neck cancer in 2009. For the people that don't know, one of the things they can relate to is the coach of the Nuggets, George Karl, had that 2 years ago. And then Michael Douglas, the actor, was diagnosed with it. It's a treatable form of cancer, but the treatment is very brutal because of the area that the radiation has to go through, and that's your throat. And
tell us how that affects.
Well, you have to have chemotherapy, and you have the radiation, which affects your throat area, and it goes through your neck. And I couldn't eat solid food for, I think, 7 months. And so I had a feeding tube, and you lose weight, and you do reach points that all of the things that you believe you have started with in terms of trying to talk yourself into getting through this become almost, well, you can't remember the talks. And then the discouragement at your inability to do simple things like walk or try to get up and go to the door or try to talk to people. And the way you look,
Physically.
everything, it just becomes such a discouragement and painful. Because the radiation creates second-degree burns in your mouth and in your throat. And, you know, you lose sleep. Your whole body mechanism becomes turned upside down. And in addition to the nausea created by the chemo, and anyway, you reach a point in those processes, and I'm sure there are other people that have gone through cancer treatments that share some of the same things, and that is you just don't really care anymore.
About?
Well, you don't have, some people may, but you don't. I never really had a suicidal tendency.
Okay.
But if the pain stopped right now and I didn't wake up, that wasn't something I was really afraid of.
Right.
And so
That much pain.
yeah, you don't really, you reach that point in the deterioration of your body.
So this is constant pain?
Sure, it burns all the time, and it's a personal choice on my part, but I never took the morphine, or I never took the other serious pain medications.
Why was that?
Well, I have a feeling I'd like that stuff too much. And so I just decided that wasn't a good thing for me to do.
Even if that would take away the pain?
Well, again, even pain medication is something that's very mental. Mm-hmm. Because in reality,
you want more.
Yeah.
You're always going to want more.
You not only want more, but it's fooling you into believing you don't have the pain.
Right.
And so it was just a very difficult process for me adapting to it, because I had to do the process. I had to go through the process. There was no way around the process. But adapting to it and understanding it and dealing with it was what was difficult for me. And I just, you count minutes at times until you can have some relief, whether it's from vomiting or whether it's from not eating.
From vomiting?
Well, you just, anything that's different that expels bad stuff.
Okay.
You feel better for a few minutes.
Yeah. You visualize yourself as feeling better. And so when you get to that level, and I'm hesitant to use the word existence, but when you get to that level of living, it's a very discouraging, very it's a non-stimulating way to live. And if you can't be stimulated,
So how did you keep strong?
Well, I had my boys. My boys at the time were 7, 8, and 9. And the belief that I didn't want to leave them. And my wife, of course, and the family and my animals. And, the idea of leaving that is not an alien idea, but all of a sudden measuring it against what I was going through, when you look at the things that are important in your life, all of a sudden, mentally, again, you can view what you're going through as kind of small. And so as long as I could...
Small compared to?
What I would be losing.
What you'd be losing.
You see, as long as you can somewhat minimize it, as long as you can mentally minimize it compared to the greater good, that will sustain you through the process. But you have to keep doing it. You have to keep remembering what it is that we're doing here. What's the point here?
What's the point?
That's it. And you cannot take your eye off of that ball, because if you do, and you all of a sudden start trying to change what the point is or what the goal is, you have to then redo a whole new mental process for that. And I wasn't equipped for that.
you did some other things on your own beyond what the medical people wanted to do. You did some of your own research and
Sure.
did some things, feeding, healthy,
Right.
how you ate. And
Right. And I still believe that I had some and developed some ideas with regard to that, well, at least for me, were created a tremendous advantage for me dealing with it. And it had to do with juicing and, smoothies of vegetables that I couldn't eat or drink, but that I could put through my feeding tube. Because one of the worst things that happens is your gastrointestinal system just goes to nothing because you don't have the necessary ingredients and nutrients to keep it alive and well. And I knew at some point that had to change. And so before I ever finished the chemo and the radiation, I was already putting in, fresh
Right.
vegetables and fruits.
Tell us what the smoothie consisted of.
In my instance, the smoothie consisted of primarily all green matter. It consisted of spinach, kale greens, collard greens, parsley, mince, and occasionally I would put in a beet or a carrot, but I would break that down in a very powerful blender with, aloe vera juice and other juices that would make it almost pure liquid. So, because it's hard to go through that tube. And, you have to push it through real slow. And it takes time, but with time, it became one of the best things that I ever did for me in terms of not only sustaining myself through the treatment, but then for recovery. Because when you stop the treatment, that's not the end of it. It's the recovery from the treatment takes several weeks just to not do it anymore because your body's used to that. And it was not a fun process. So.
Well, one of your goals that we had talked about was running Way to Cool.
Right.
And so we're talking about treatment at the end of 2009.
Yeah, the treatment actually ended the first week in September from me going to get the radiation treatments. But then it was another 3 months before I could begin to put swallow solid foods.
And Way to Cool is in March.
Right.
So you didn't have much training time
Right.
to get ready for that 50K.
Right. One of the other aspects of, I think, what we're discussing here, mental toughness, is setting goals which are realistic, but which are also somewhat, some people would say, fantastical. In other words, look at it and say, well, that's a nice goal, but, I don't think so. And I've always been one to set the bar, so to speak, higher than what most people would think would be a good setting. And again, going back to Robin Williams's, quote, depends on how big that spark is.
Right.
So I remember talking to you at the time, and I can't and never will be able to thank you for the support you gave me emotionally in terms of whether you believed it or not, telling me that we could do it. And I would constantly, I probably bugged you to death, but I would constantly call you to give you updates on how I was doing and what I was doing and everything, and you kept assuring me it was going to be just fine. And I needed to get into the race, not to run it, but to prove to myself that I had completely overcome this affliction, that it was not something that was going to affect me, not just for when I was going through it, but it was not going to affect me for the rest of my life. And the sooner I could get back to a normal life that you and me knew, the more I was assured in my own mind that this was not the monster that I had been led to believe it was.
You beat it.
What do you,
Well,
You
even
moved
To-
on.
you were there, Tony.
No, I know I was
What do
there.
you remember about that run?
I remember he was tired.
And I was real skinny.
He was really skinny.
Skinny and tired?
Yeah. And he loved going up Main Bar.
Bar.
Yeah.
Show it to me. Show it to me. Where's Main Bar? I can't.
But
I
he
can't.
finished. I do remember he finished.
You finished.
Right.
You did finish.
And again, it's cliche-ish and probably overused, but the goal was to finish. I didn't have a set time that I needed to do it in. It was just to finish it.
Not just.
Well, not just because I enjoyed it, because I enjoyed being with you. I enjoyed doing what we have always done.
Mm-hmm.
But there were times when I didn't think I was going to finish it.
Well, sure.
And again.
And then what did you tell yourself, if you remember, during those times?
Well, it was the same sort of rhetoric I was going through when we were doing the 100 miles. You have to carry it past the negative, if you will, aspects of the conversation to laughing at yourself because you see what you're doing to yourself. And you take your mind back to, okay, what was the plan? What was the plan in November? What was the plan in February? And here we are. Why is the plan changing? And so you have this little dual conversation with yourself, and I contend that if you're mentally tough, the conversation side of it that pushes you on is the side that will out-talk the other one. And basically by saying, I know what you're doing.
If your daddy was with you at that particular time, what might that conversation have looked like? If you transported your daddy?
My father was a very extraordinary person, and he loved sayings, somewhat like your quote about the spark of madness. One of his favorite sayings had to do with change, and it had to do with when you recognize something in you that you don't like. And he would say, it's not a sin to have a dirty comb, but it's a sin to keep one. And so, it wasn't bad for me to have the negative thoughts. Those were perfectly okay.
That's true.
But you better not keep them.
Smart man.
You better get rid of them, because if you don't, then that's when bad things happen.
Your daddy had other sayings.
Oh, he would say things like, whenever I thought too much of myself or I thought I was really something, he would remind me that the size of a man's funeral is going to depend on the weather. And, at the time, I just attributed it to this old man that didn't know what he was talking about. And Daddy, that's why I'm, Daddy, you're not cool like me. And so I attributed it to a lot of different things, but it's funny how we remember certain things and how certain things that had significance in your life at the time, even if you didn't know the significance, stay with you. And he died in 2000. And even before that, I began to appreciate how he raised me and what he tried to convey to me, because I come from a big family. There were 4 boys and a girl. And
In what part of the country?
I come from, I come from the deep, deep South in Georgia, in deep South Georgia. And so I grew up in a rural town where storytelling and where oral and where, the spoken word is a much more powerful, it's a much more powerful medium than, I love to read, but it's more powerful than that. And so his teachings stayed with me, and with years took on different meanings and became much more significant. So that now I'm teaching those same things to my 3 boys who are, still impressionable and not yet at the age where they can say, Daddy, you're not cool.
Are you sure? Are you sure?
Well, I haven't heard it yet.
Okay.
Although I do find once in a while I'm being ignored. But
No.
nevertheless, yeah.
Now, your daddy was an attorney,
Yes.
and as I recall, he was involved in the 60s in the civil rights
Yes.
movement.
He was in the rural town. The Freedom Riders. I don't know how many people watching may remember that.
Maybe
but
you would tell us a little bit about it?
the civil rights movement was, obviously it was nationwide, but what people remember and what the country remembers is the difficulties that movement and the people that were involved in that movement encountered in the South, particularly places like Mississippi and Alabama. Georgia, of course, South Carolina. All of the South posed a lot of problems for the civil rights movement for reasons that are historical and well known. My father, however, took a different position. Not that he was by himself, because there were other people that believed like he did, but he believed that everybody had an equal right to achieve the same types of goals and have the same aspirations as everybody else. And in the process of believing that, he exhibited it.
He's an attorney.
He was an attorney. He helped and assisted the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders were people that came from the North to go through and help set up the polling stations, because voting was not something that
It was problematic back
was
then.
very problematic. And everybody remembers the murders that occurred in Mississippi and other places as a result of those, that assistance from the North.
Those kids.
Yes. He represented before Gideon versus Wainwright. That's the one where the Supreme Court said that you have a right to an attorney in certain cases. He represented black people before that became the law. And he just...
So is he like Atticus?
Well, that's my oldest son's name. It's funny you'd say that. When I went to the movie and saw To Kill a Mockingbird, I thought it was my daddy that was portrayed by Gregory Peck. And so I named my oldest son Atticus in remembrance of that. But yes, he had that country lawyer. That's what's on his tombstone. He was just a country lawyer.
Okay.
He had
But he
that.
really wasn't just the country lawyer.
No, he was philosopher. He was, magician. He was.
But even in the military, he was.
He was a judge. He was in the Judge Advocate Corps in Korea, and saw a lot of suffering and a lot of hardship in Korea. That was a big event for him in his life. He used to tell me, he didn't talk much about the war, but Korea was a hard place for him to be with regard to all of the suffering and the poverty that existed
Among the people?
among the people, yeah. And so when he came back, he practiced in a real small town. Douglas, Georgia is a small town. And it's grown, it's bigger today, but it's still a small town.
Is that where you
USA.
grew up?
That's where I grew up, yes. Near some people may know where the cartoon characters Pogo come from, the Okefenokee Swamp.
Oh, okay.
All right.
So that's what I come from, and I came to the land of whatever in California.
How'd you end up out here?
Well, people ask me that, and I tell them in my 1968 GTO. But
Were you carrying beer across the state line?
all those cores were coming the other way.
Right.
I finished. I basically came to California on a dare. I'd gone that summer. I'd started my law school career at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, and I'd gone home for the summer, and some friends and I were out having some beers and celebrating the summer, and I was telling them about, we always grew up seeing the news about California and the bikinis and the volleyball, and California to the southern boy was a place, but it was mystical. It wasn't real, And so we all were talking about it one night over beers and sitting on the hoods of cars and that kind of stuff. And I opened my mouth.
That's what you did in southern Georgia?
That's what you did a lot of, yeah.
Okay.
And indicated that I could go to California if I wanted to, because I'd gotten accepted to law school out here. And of course that brought a whole round of brouhahas and yeah, rights and all this kind of stuff. Well, I was in it now. So to put my money where my mouth was.
Is this part of mental toughness?
It might be, because driving out here was a lot.
Or might be that spark.
Yeah, I had some sparks then. That grew into a fire as I was crossing. I came out on Route 66.
All right.
And so I didn't have any friends here. I had hardly any money in my pocket. And so, but I just knew what I had to do. And I suppose that qualifies as mental toughness too, because I didn't have anything when I got here.
You're how old at this point?
At this point, I was 23.
Young man.
Yeah, I didn't see obstacles. I didn't see things like no money for apartments, because in Georgia, an apartment was $25 a month. Well, I could afford that. I didn't have a problem affording that.
So now you're in the Bay Area.
Now I'm up here.
Yeah.
And no, I've been here since 1978 now. And, I've been very lucky. I've been very fortunate. And some people say you make your luck. I don't know how true that is, but I know I've been fortunate. And for whatever part of my existence has been the result of mental toughness that, required that exertion of mental toughness to get through, I don't know. But looking back, I have to say that if I, look at the qualitative part of those times that required the mental toughness, there is something about those times that there's something appealing about. And I think the part of it that's appealing is you do things that you never thought of doing. You never thought you could do. You never gave a lot of thought to. And all of a sudden you find yourself doing it, and there's a certain degree of satisfaction and enjoyment.
What are some of those other things you haven't mentioned, maybe?
With regard to what you get from the mental toughness?
Not only that, but the goals, the things that you're going to do that you hadn't thought about.
In the beginning, they're more.
Because that might go back to basketball. But you had told me about a time in junior, senior high on the football field.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And that was a funny story, and that may or may not be mental toughness, but it was part of your definition when we talked about in terms of making choices and thinking about the consequences.
Well,
so let's go back to
when I was a freshman in high school.
And on the football field. on the football field. 'Cause I think that's important right here.
Well, as I'm sure anybody that's listening or watching this knows, the South is football country.
I've heard that.
The SEC that's their
king.
It's king. And as a young boy growing up in the South, playing football, you would think, is in our DNA. You have to do it. And so
you had to do it.
I had to do it along with my friends, because you certainly didn't want to be looked down upon.
Did your daddy want you to do it?
My father was not the kind of ardent parent, Southern parent about football that a lot of my friends were.
Okay.
He was more interested in academics. If you wanted to play the sports, that was good, but you had to handle
It was secondary to
It
your.
was always secondary to the academics. But what he was unbending on was, if you committed to it, you had to finish it. And the reason for that
Old
was,
school,
Sounds familiar.
old school, right?
and the reason for that was not because of your personal wishes, but because your teammates had learned to count on you, and they were depending on you, and you couldn't let them down. So I signed up for football, and there we were. And I don't know that many people really know what it's like in August in Georgia, but
Hot and humid.
There's songs that talk about hotter than asphalt in Georgia in August, and it was that type of a summer that year.
And you're how big back then?
Well, I was probably 6 feet tall, but I probably weighed a grand total of 130.
Jeez.
But you know, and the pads were heavy than me. But
Did the helmet weigh you down?
the helmet, well, it was wobbly. It was wobbly. Really get a good fit good. But you know, I had it on, and I felt good going out there with the rest of them. Because in helmets, you're kind of anonymous. We're all big football players.
But there's a number on you.
You're
Yeah,
indestructible.
you
Yeah,
got
with that. Yeah.
You got that. Until we got to the drill, where everybody has to circle up, and the coach.
This is funny, Tony.
Well,
this is
it's
funny.
not that funny. Where the coach calls your number, this number that has given you identity, and you have to go to the center, and you do those little leg pumping drills and everything, and then he calls another number, and that person is supposed to come out, and you have to get down and hit each other. But you don't know where it's coming from. So that is supposed to develop some sort of agility.
Okay.
Well, I saw the first couple ahead of me do this. And all of a sudden, I wanted my number to kind of blend a little bit. Well, that was the first dead giveaway that Jordan's next. And so I got into it, and as we talked about some of the mental toughness that goes along with some of the events in our lives, you start asking, what am I doing here? And I was in my position, and I got down in my position, and all of a sudden, my friend, who became my friend for years, Jamie Walker,
Okay.
who was a lineman.
He probably had more weight than
And
you.
He weighed a little more than 130. He got called, and here he came, and he literally picked me about 3 feet off the ground. And that was when I wanted to end that process. And
Excuse me, sir. This is a very interesting conversation. We would really love to hear what you're saying, so we're going to try and put your mic back on.
Oh,
It disappeared
Oh,
somewhere.
it's right
So
here.
we would love to be able to hear you, so if you don't mind,
Go ahead.
we will just make
You
sure.
like the story? I like it.
I think
You
I'm
like
going to
the
like it.
story?
I know that these guys like it because they're laughing their heads off. And we can't know what it's about.
Oh, you don't know what
So,
it's about.
No.
Oh,
So
okay.
let's go back to.
Thank you.
Where did we stop? Oh. So, there'll be editing,
Let's go.
I guess.
Well, no. Let's go back
it's
to.
alive.
Let's go back to Georgia football.
Okay. So, anyway, after Jamie Walker hit me hard enough to knock me about
Now
three,
go before to. Let's go back and tell
the circle.
the circle and 130 pounds, 6
Okay.
feet.
I weighed, at the age of 14, I was 6 feet tall and weighed 130 pounds. And joined my friends in their pursuit of football stardom.
And your father.
My father supported athletics, but only as a secondary activity to academics.
Okay.
He was a very big,
But if you started something.
if you started it, his belief was you had to finish it.
Okay.
And that circled around the idea that other people on your team counted on you.
So now we're in what temperature on the football field and the climate?
It's probably close to 100. The humidity's probably around 95.
Might as well be
And
raining.
I got 100-pound pads on. And the helmet probably weighed 25, or at least it felt like all of this. And we did the drill where you form the circle and the coach calls your number, and you have to get down in a position, football position, and you do the foot motion where you chop your feet, and the coach calls another individual to come out and hit you. And the idea is you develop the agility to move quickly to get down into a stance to protect another runner or another football player. Well,
Clever drill.
well, that's okay if you both are of the same size. But the linemen on that team were Jamie Walker was probably 220. Jamie was what we used to call back then corn-fed. He was big. And he came out after his number was called and leveled me and picked me about 3 feet up off the ground and pushed me over to the other end of the circle, one side of the circle. And it's one of those things that addles you, we used to say. You really got to get the cobwebs out after that kind of thing and wonder,
What am I doing here?
do I want to get back up and do this again? And so I think I remember the coach putting me back in and doing it with about 2 or 3 other players. And I went home and said, Daddy, I just don't think this is it for me. But he wasn't very sympathetic with that. And so I finished it that year, and then came basketball season. And basketball was what I considered my cup of tea. And so I even played baseball that year.
Okay.
But I couldn't see that ball for anything when it would come
Baseball?
across the plate.
Baseball.
Yeah.
So your sport really was basketball.
It completely, basketball became my life's obsession. And I love that game even today. And so, matter of fact, I went to college on a basketball scholarship.
Really?
And so all my brothers, we all played because, you know, in those days, people that played athletics, and you probably remember, Frank, the weekends were meant with meeting up with your friends and playing all day until dark. And, you know, we had a backboard that was nailed to a tree, and we had the ground beating around. And
That's a little different than the backboard you put together for
the boys.
For the boys.
I bought the boys a basketball goal from some sporting goods store, and it came in 3,422 parts. And Tara had to read the book and measure. They got measurements for the bolts. I knew, again, mental toughness came in because I knew I was in over my head. I would have even been happy to not return it and just throw it.
Throw it away.
Throw it away. But I finished it, and the boys are playing probably right now. But, you know, the mental toughness, as we said earlier, contains a lot of elements. And I think that it's just as important when you begin an adventure, when you have set a goal, that you do look at the parameters of those goals and what path you're trying to get to it on. Because I dare say that I have done things before, and other people as well, that, you know, you look back and say, if I had given that a little more thought, that might not have been the path, you know, I would have chosen. And, you know, with a little thought and with a little consideration for some of those parameters, I don't call them obstacles, because the idea of not seeing the obstacles is there regardless.
You're reframing that.
Yes.
Not necessarily an obstacle.
How does it relate to your job?
Well, before you go, related to this, I was going to ask Jonathan too, is your dilemma, this is part of mental toughness too, as a defense attorney, especially if you think the person you're representing is guilty.
There is, in my particular field of law, which is criminal defense, there always exists a dichotomy between, most people use the word guilty.
Okay.
I don't use the word guilty because that's reserved for a determination by a judge or a group of people after a presentation of facts. But the dichotomy exists between conduct, which is alleged to be criminal, and the person's rights to have that conduct judged in a certain way. And all too often, I think, people, and because all defense attorneys are people, have a tendency to judge and examine the conduct without the process. And our laws, our statutes, give us the process which you have to go through in the legal system to determine that guilt.
Or innocence.
Or innocence. But the dilemma was much bigger in my early career because you would see certain things and you would hear certain things that you just either were appalled by, shocked by, or, you know, you found revolting.
The behavior.
The behavior. And it took a while to get to the point where the behavior is just a component part of this whole thing. And you then look at the process that's going to be utilized to determine what's going to be the outcome of the judgment of that behavior. But even today, there are certain things that I have to step back and say, when I see certain behaviors, this is not for me to judge. It's not something that I have to question myself about because that's not my job. My job is to make sure that the process that has been given to every citizen of this country is followed and afforded to this individual. But you have to develop a certain
That's
mental...
the job.
That's the job.
Okay.
And regardless of how I feel about what the conduct was and what the result of the conduct was, I have this to do. And
Have
How
you
do you-
ever
yeah,
said
go ahead.
no?
yes, I have. Very rarely, but there have been some cases that I just didn't feel I was up to with regard to the mental toughness, because the conduct and the individual, along with other circumstances, presented itself to me in such a way that I knew early on that I wasn't up for that. It would be the same as somebody loading up in the airplane and let's go into the bottom of Mount Everest and say, let's go. I mean, you could certainly say, okay, but you know, you better look at the parameters real quick here. And it's that kind of a thing when I was talking about you have to look at certain goals and you have to examine consequences or potential consequences. And I don't believe that the cases I said no to, that I know I made the right decision. And so, but it's another form of mental toughness, I guess.
We have just a few more minutes. Is there some brief thing that you want to say about your practice or about a case that you've had?
No, not really. A lot of that's personal to people that were involved in those, and so I don't really, you know, without them being here, I don't like talking about cases unless it's well publicized and people know about it. But I suppose since the topic has been mental toughness, and since we've somewhat discussed it both, you know, jocularly as well as seriously, everybody, I believe, has the ability to look at goals, whatever those goals are, whether the goal is to have a healthy family, whether the goal is to be healthy yourself, whether it's to be successful, whatever the goal is, I believe everybody has the ability to go after that goal with an intensity that gives you a better than average assurance you're going to achieve it, as long as you don't let the thoughts and let the distractions and let the obstacles become bigger than the goal.
Focus, focus.
That's right.
Focus.
Remember what you're here for. Remember, if you're married and you want to argue, it's not about you and her, it's about the children. Remember that when you want to go out and do this instead of this, it's not about that. It's about going out and training. Remember what you're, and so if you just engage in that internal dialogue, anybody can have what
But
we
you
call.
But you have to know how to rethink it,
Exactly.
and that's a key.
That's a key, and you learn that from people. You talk about it, you practice it, you do it in yourself, and you watch how you evolve. And
It's a practice that's important.
that's right.
You actually can train yourself.
Exactly.
Be
And
mentally tough.
Hopefully.
and to close it with another one of my daddy's sayings, getting to heaven is heaven. So the practice is where the enjoyment is.
So give us you told us a couple of your daddy's sayings. Give us one of yours.
Once I had to define for myself, it's funny we talk about it, I had to create for my own self, when I was doing some introspection, definitions for words. And I decided to define as accurately as I could for myself what happiness meant. And what I concluded was, and I remind myself of this every day, happiness is not having a sense of need or urgency to leave where you are right now.
I like that.
Well, for me personally, it defined pretty much what made me happy. Not the quantitative, but the qualitative.
Exactly.
And so if I didn't need to leave where I was or had a need to get away from it right now, then I felt like
You're happy.
I'm happy.
You know, unfortunately, we have a blank,
Blank screen.
and I couldn't tell you how happy.